Awesome. Um, Absolutely. Welcome to the inaugural interview of series here with AI and the Fed. I'm Nick Shutt, your host, and love to introduce Matt Teschke. Matt, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure thing, Nick. Yeah, happy to be here. As Nick said, I'm Matt Teschke. I'm CTO at Redhorse. I've been around in the kind of federal space for about 10 years, initially as a data scientist and then focusing on AI and ML research. First half of my career was more in economics. But yeah, I've been really excited to be in this field. And as we'll kind of, get into, there's been a lot going on, in the last few years.
Absolutely. 100%, man. How did you go from economics to AI?
That's a great question. I think, I tell a lot of people, luck plays a big part in your career. But I think, starting out in economics, I liked the programming side of it. We weren't doing a ton of it, but I did have a proclivity for it. I did like using Stata and SAS at the time, which, I couldn't even write the most basic thing nowadays, but that's how I kind of got started. And then, was thinking about, getting into something more technical and ended up getting a data science role at a small company. And then from there, it was really being self-taught. So I went on Kaggle, which is a data science competition site, took classes on Coursera, asked a lot of questions of my, teammates. And then it's just kind of come from there. I've been fortunate to, have great teams kind of over the years and rely on them as I progressed from kind of what I would consider less technical to being at least somewhat technical now.
That's fantastic, man. And would you tell us a little bit about Red Horse and what you guys do in the federal space?
Sure thing. Yeah, in the federal space, we're a mid-sized company, so it's about 450 people right now after an acquisition in the fall. And we are it's a technology-enabled services provider. And we have three different practice areas. We have our energy, environment, and civilian. We have our cyber analytics, which is kind of say analyzing cyber-related data. And then we have our national security portfolio, which is where a lot of our data science and machine learning work resides. So we do knowledge graph work. Predictive maintenance is a big thrust of ours. And then we've actually supported Project Maven from pretty early on. And then my interest, having joined Redhorse about 6 months ago, is in the kind of AI and most recently the impacts that generative AI can have in the federal space.
Well, fantastic, man. That's beautiful. I appreciate the background, and as we um hear more and more about tools like ChatGPT and Claude and other generative AI tools out there. What is differentiates this from many of the other fads out there? Things like metaverse and blockchain that we're going to, impact the government at a fundamental level.
Yeah, I think after the cloud, which had, is Nick, right, a huge impact in the federal space. I
Mhm.
think there was initially some skepticism at first, and rightly so. I think there are more constraints in the federal space, especially on the national security side. You can't, you have to be a little more careful than maybe if you're a startup in Silicon Valley. And so, but I think by kind of the late 2010s, the cloud is pretty well accepted in the federal space, and I think a lot of people, at least maybe in the contractor side, were kind of looking for what's that next big thing now that I think the federal government widely adopted cloud. And we had, the blockchain, we had the metaverse, and people started pushing those. And I think that those can be really useful technologies. Like I think the blockchain in gaming is really interesting, but doesn't have as much applicability in the federal space. Maybe the metaverse and digital twins has some impact. So yeah, so there is that I think skepticism, right? Because we maybe as an industry tried to push some technologies that didn't have that broad appeal, or at least not yet. ChatGPT, I think, is one of those things that, if you just start using it for a few minutes, and I remember, I sat my brother down who runs a small business, and I've been kind of bugging him to try it out for a while. And I just went through some of the, demos of, writing a job post about a pretty technical position that he was. And he's like, oh, wow, that's, better than what we have in our job site right now.
Mhm.
Had it write like a technical report on some topic, kind of the same thing. And this does it in, 5 seconds.
Mhm.
So you can kind of realize just from using it the impact that it can have. And then it also has that broad applicability. You don't need to be a cloud architect and get AWS certified to use these technologies. I can sit down with my 6-year-old daughter and she can learn how to get value from these tools. So anybody across the federal space, who has access to these tools, whether it's the back office, analyst, software developers, they can make use of these tools. And I think that's why it has the potential to have such broad impact, is that low barrier to entry and the broad applicability as well.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. And what do you think some of the most impactful developments of, are going to be? And also, what do you think some of the most interesting use cases out there are?
Yeah. And I think that, maybe some of the recent developments that have been really impactful, lead to another reason why I think it might have such, broad impact is the amount of investment that's going in it. So it's not just a handful of companies. I think I saw a stat, it was, $50 billion of GPUs were bought last year. It is just like orders of
Mm.
magnitude, more than a lot of other technologies at a rate that we haven't really seen. And so while Chat GPT, is that use case I think that a lot of people have seen, that was a year ago or even a year and a half ago since ChatGPT came out. So if that's kind of your perspective of what this technology is, which makes sense, right? Not everybody has the ability to follow this, on a daily basis or even an hourly basis. So some of the developments I think that are most interesting and related use cases would be open source models will have a huge impact in this space. So there's kind of, within the community, there's this closed source versus open source kind of battle, kind of the closed source being OpenAI, Google, and others who have their model and are not releasing the model weights. And then you have kind of, Meta, very timely conversation we're having. They released Llama 3 yesterday, which is a GPT-4 class model, with the GPT-4 kind of being the best of the best and what everybody measures up to.
Hmm.
Early indications are that this new open source model is something that is now not really open source. They're open weights. There's a slight difference we won't get into. But that's going to put it at people's fingertips. You can actually, I think, download it in an app on your phone now in Hugging Chat. So that's just going to open up, anytime you have more openness, is going to open up the possibilities. But then beyond kind of the text use cases, you get, text to image models. That's something that I use pretty frequently for just PowerPoint presentations, or LinkedIn is kind of spicing something up. And I'm getting higher quality images that are tailored to my specific use case, often like a Redhorse Easter egg, maybe in the background or something as well. And then going beyond that, if you've seen the text to video models, are just like, I am still in awe when I see these, and I can write a sentence and get a 1 minute video that's cohesive, high quality, and that just makes you think like, where we were a few years ago, where we are now, and then where we extended out. I mean,
Hmm.
you're gonna be able to create, custom shorts that are 5 or 10 minutes long, probably from a prompt, and maybe some, you drop in some drawings or sketches or something like that. So again, that's not as much impact in the federal space, but that's really interesting. And I think going forward, the way that we're going to interact with these tools is the idea of agents. And for folks who haven't heard that term, that's maybe more like autonomous, LLMs that you can kind of set them as set them on a task to go on their way, come back in maybe minutes, hours, even days. And we're
Hmm.
really just starting to scratch the surface with that technology.
Absolutely. Really appreciate that. What do you think, how do you think the government's going to utilize generative AI specifically, and, other tools beyond generative AI as well?
Yeah. Again, I think they're going to approach it cautiously, which I think is they should, right? As we said, there is a much higher barrier to using any sort of technology in the federal space, and I think they do need to approach it with skepticism. There are some organizations working on less sensitive missions that maybe can try it out, more readily than others. And we saw that with the cloud too, right? And we still see that with technology in the cloud. I get excited when something's released at, Amazon reInvent, and then you realize, oh, it's not going to be in C2S, in the classified, cloud space for, maybe 2 years, 3 years, maybe longer, if ever, because there has to be that demand there. So I think, approaching it cautious, and I think actually, DHS recently released their policy, and I think they're really doing it the right way. And the way that they're approaching it is they are allowing people to use the tools internally, but they're setting, some pretty broad guidelines, such as having approved tools. So I like that because there are, hundreds of different tools out there, and you can, maybe some of them you don't know where they're hosted, if they're in adversary countries, maybe the models were developed by adversaries. And so kind of having that, approved list of tools is a great start. That's what we've actually done at Redhorse as well. Um, Providing training so that people understand, bias, hallucinations, those sorts of things, and what to look out for when using these tools. And then limiting it to low risk use cases as well. So making sure that, PII and other data isn't just being sent out, out into the cloud or wherever else, that you lose control of it. Again, in the federal space, there are a lot of concerns around that. And then when you get to the classified domain, it kind of ramps it up. So
Mm-hmm.
DHS is allowing people, across the organization, once they've taken this training and kind of, said that they understand or demonstrated that they understand these risks, that they can use them on low risk use cases. So, say writing a public press release using publicly available documents. All of that stuff is already out on the internet. It's going to be on the internet. So the risk of something, kind of bad happening is pretty low,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're maintaining a human in the loop, right? So we kind of talked about, bias being one of those concerns. And then they are in a kind of more, I would say, constructive way, or set way. They have 3 pilots as well, kind of again on low risk use cases such as drafting content, summarizing content, and helping with training. So things that have a human in the loop, you're reviewing the content. So I think broadly, that's the way. I think the way that they're doing it is a good way for organizations to start approaching using these technologies.
Fantastic. And do you know what goes into the approval process for apps at DHS?
I do not. They had a list of, I think, maybe just 4 of the ones there. If I were doing it, I think, you kind of, and actually, this is what we do at Redhorse, right? I go and I look at the privacy policy, and, I think, and kind of the, how they're going to use your data, and what, um, controls do they have over that? Who can look at it under what circumstances? Are they using it to retrain the model or not? That was a big concern early on because Chat GPT was, the reason why it was free, right? If it's free, you're the product a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
And so the reason why Chat GPT was free is because they were using the data and those interactions to train the model.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that you want to obviously, not have as you're the government, not have models trained on your interactions, your data. So I imagine that those are the types of things that they're looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we at Artemis and at my Healing My Wellness, my mental health company, and at the new organization that I'm starting, my new government contracting company, we pay for the premium subscription of ChatGPT, and when you do that, that excludes you from having your data used to train everything, and to train their model, and yeah, I mean, it's inexpensive, right? I think it's like $30 per user per month, which is well worth it when
Yeah.
you think about, because to your point, like I'm pulling graphics out of it. I'm having it create, all kinds of stuff. I'm having it help, create job descriptions, put client names in there potentially. And it's just things that I don't necessarily want them to. I'm sure they have access to it still, right? But I just don't want them to use it to retrain their model.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think they have access to it, but I think they at least, I know some of the organizations will delete it, after, 14 days or 30 days.
Hmm.
And they will also only look at it, if it's being flagged for nefarious use cases, right? If it's, and I think OpenAI and Microsoft actually identified some foreign adversaries using, Chat GPT or similar tools
Hmm.
in cyber campaigns. And so then those were shut down. So yeah, there are kind of automated triggers, I think, but obviously kind of given the scale of data they're doing, there's not somebody sitting there reviewing, every query that Nick is sending through to OpenAI.
Let's hope not.
Yeah,
I don't want to be on that
yeah,
list.
yeah.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, how do do you know what some of the nefarious, like the quote unquote nefarious use cases are, and what goes into that decision process?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine, it's, I would imagine some sort of, it's probably not just as simple as keyword. They're more sophisticated than that. But, if you use these models, you can get it to classify text. Is it, related to pornography? Is it related to prostitution or drugs? Or in this case, cybercrime.
Hmm.
So I imagine that it would be pretty rare for somebody to get triggered on like a single, interaction, but
Hmm.
they, the scale of the data that they have, and just the compute power and knowledge that they have there, it's going to be kind of a body of evidence probably over time of somebody how they're using these tools.
That makes sense. Yeah, because I could imagine, I know you can use it to write code, and I could imagine somebody, using it to, insert, like create, some malevolent code to put in, in something that they write, or create a snippet there. Or,
Yeah,
actually, last night I was talking to some people, and I heard that somebody at some event with an AI expert, this guy had a local model on his machine. He asked it how to like overthrow the US government or something, right? And it would give you like a
yeah,
pretty detailed list of step by step, here's how you do it. But things like that I would imagine would be barred from.
Yeah. Although what was interesting is at least in the kind of two campaigns that they publicly identified, they were also using them for things that you and I are using it for, right? So large cyber enabled criminal organizations,
Hmm.
they have communication and maybe not quite job posts, but like public posts and stuff.
Hmm.
And especially if English isn't their first language, this can help them be more efficient at their job and spend their time on other things as well. So it seemed like that they were also using it to understand documents, to summarize things, to draft things, in addition maybe to some of the more what you would think would be more obvious like code enabled that use
Hmm.
cases as well. And yeah, I mean, to your point, even if OpenAI is shutting this down, there are open source models that are guardrail free. And there's even one, I won't bother naming it here, but
Hmm.
there is one that is, available on Hugging Face, and it is a cyber, focused model. And
Hmm.
you can ask it, like, how do I get into somebody else's Wi-Fi network and not leave a trace? And it will walk you through step by step, and it will give you the commands to do it. I'm not a cyber expert. I don't know the quality of that, and would that just be easily detected by a normal, defenses or not?
Hmm.
But you can imagine if that's available open source, that our adversaries are at least investigating that, if not actively employing those types of open source models without guardrails.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm not a cyber expert by any stretch of the imagination either, but I would imagine that it would be effective for those, the folks that just use the router that is given to you by your cable or your cable company or internet provider. However, if you have another one sitting in between, I would guess that that would probably be pretty effective. But again, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. So, uh, but yeah, man. So what?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the agents that I mentioned.
Mhm. Go ahead.
Oh, I would say going back to the agents, that I mentioned earlier as well. You could imagine though that as these models get more sophisticated in the next generation, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has said GPT-5 is going to be just as much of a leap ahead of GPT-4 as the GPT-4 was from 3, which blows my mind. It's hard to kind of understand that, but they're going to be much better at logic, reasoning, coding. And so you could imagine on the cyber side, kind of setting one of these loose, and it just iterates through and tries, different things, and it's learned from, kind of all the vulnerabilities that are in the public domain,
Mhm.
learned from blog posts and postmortems. And so you could kind of, they're tireless, right? And computers don't get bored, or don't get bored, don't get tired. It could run 24/7, just kind of on somebody's network or something, just
Mhm.
poking and prodding at kind of another level than current capabilities.
Absolutely, and I mean, I could see, from a nefarious use case perspective. I'm sure you're familiar with the quote unquote the pig butchering scams, and I'm sure you've gotten the text messages as well from some random person that is like, "Oh, I accidentally sent you this number," and then they build a rapport with you, and then they try to pull you to like WhatsApp, and then next thing you know, if you don't know, because so many people don't know, and I feel like, especially since the pandemic, there's just an epidemic of loneliness that's been going around and
Yeah,
continuing to go around, and so many people are looking for connection, and you think that, maybe they can use something like that to iterate, and to have those conversations and carry on, unfortunately.
yeah.
Mhm. You know?
Yeah, and they can make it more personalized too, right? If I wanted to target, Nick, but not just you, but 100 other people, I could create a research, service or a bot to go out, scrape your LinkedIn, Twitter, and
Mhm.
then, building that rapport, I could be like, oh, hey, Nick, I saw you at this conference last week that you posted about, or that a recording was, and I won't have to have taken the time to watch it. I could
Mhm.
summarize it, get the key points, and make it seem like I'm really interested in, you personally, and maybe
Mhm.
you're going to be more trusting and let your guard down a bit then.
Yeah, absolutely. As obviously all these bad actors and these nefarious use cases are out there, what do you think that there's a market for, utilizing it to defend ourselves and defend us, and how would that work?
There is, I think, it's a game of cat and mouse, like anything. I think on the kind of defense side of it, the first one is just training and awareness. So I think making people aware that, you know, with 10 seconds to a minute, I can basically clone your voice.
Mhm.
And from a single image now, I can create then a video of you, maybe talking even in real time or near real time.
Hmm.
And some people might think that, if you and I are chatting on a Zoom, you're reacting to what I'm saying in a human-like and intelligent way. Oh, then you're obviously a real person. I think that is not going to be, it may not be true now. It's certainly not going to be true in a year or so. So the first thing is just, that your threshold for what seems off, kind of just that trigger needs to be a little bit more of a hair trigger than maybe
Hmm.
it was before. It's not just that, text message, it's not just that email. But you could use it, on maybe the cyber side, kind of red teaming your own system. So we kind of talked about the agent finding, vulnerabilities from the, bad actor side, but you could also have that from kind of the white hat, side as well, where every once in a while you probe your own systems,
Hmm.
and maybe search for weaknesses. But yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's something that we are just starting to wrap our heads around. Because on the agent side, I just saw a paper the other day that agents can operate autonomously, and for them to be valuable, you might give them access to your email or to your files.
Hmm.
Well, I saw a research paper that talked about then basically deploying a worm via the language models on your system, and then using your email system, which you've given your agent access to exfiltrate emails from your email system.
Wow.
And so there's that, that desire, hey, I can just use agents to automate all this stuff in my business and my life. But then you need to think of the flip side of that, right? Especially if you're the federal government too, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
If a bad actor gets in there with with that level of permissions, how are you going to stop that?
Absolutely.
And actually, Llama 3, the Meta release yesterday, it of course doesn't get as much attention, but they actually did release a lot of safeguards as well in there.
Hmm.
There's the idea of kind of LLM firewalls to maybe analyze, at a higher fidelity or with, more rigor, kind of what's going in and coming out of models as well. So I think there's going to need to be a lot more work done there. But
Yeah.
in the federal space, I'll say too, just that's why I'm always advocating focus on low risk things where low risk tasks where there's a human in the loop.
Hmm.
Don't go for the holy grail and automate everything. Like there's so much low hanging fruit in the federal space for writing job descriptions, summarizing news articles, helping with press releases. I mean, it's
Hmm.
going to take us honestly probably years in the federal space to get people on board with those pretty low level tasks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was at I think I mentioned this last time we spoke, because I was at an AI conference a couple weeks ago that I think you were supposed to be at on,
Was
unfortunately.
it? Yeah.
And one of the federal employees who was speaking there, he had mentioned wanting to, use a AI to upclass and downclass classified information and review everything. And obviously, of course, I understand the desire to try to automate that because that's so labor intensive and so detailed. But that just seems like one of those higher risk, quote unquote, holy grail ones that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard. It's funny. I heard that about 6 or 7 years ago.
Hmm.
And it kind of scared me then. Because yeah, if I get to, 95% accuracy is pretty good for a lot of things. If you're declassifying things or, maybe 95% is not quite good enough. And actually I was on a call, within an industry call where a government person was speaking just before this, and they mentioned kind of same thing, potentially looking at it for classification reviews because a lot of material was generated in the last 25 years that's coming up on its kind of end of timeline to be publicly released. And yeah, that is tough. I think on the flip side of that too is you know AI doesn't need to be perfect, and this is something that I realized on the first project I was working on, which I'll touch on in a second. But a lot of times I think people are like, oh, it's not at 100%, I can't use it. And
Hmm.
that's not true, right? It's, you can use it. There's a lot of tasks that I just don't have the time to get to. And maybe it would be better to have AI write the draft for me and then I spend 30 seconds reviewing it so I can just get it done and out. Then it just sits at the bottom of my to-do list for weeks on end. So we all have a lot of tasks like that where you don't need to give the best, best writing that Nick has ever done doesn't need to be on every single task.
Hmm.
And so, there's those sorts of things. So in the federal space, if you're talking about classification review, maybe you don't have the bandwidth to do something that is just needs to be done by a certain time by regulations. And so you can accept, we're going to maybe just even chop off like the 20%, we know these program names are still classified. So just go through and search the program names, kind of basic stuff. And then if there's, where it starts to get in the gray area where the model's not 100% confident on it, then you filter that to a person. And
Mhm.
maybe that only saves you 10% or 20% of your time, but at the scale that the government works at, saving 10% on those tasks actually, is pretty darn beneficial.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then and it's fascinating. So what you mentioned the first project you worked on or you
Oh
learned that you
yeah.
to be perfect. What was that?
Yeah, that's something I love talking about because, I've been very fortunate. We talked about, luck playing a big part in the career. And when I was, tapped to lead our machine learning center of excellence at a company called Novetta, which was that first, company that I worked for, um, at the same time, there was this step change in capability. So it's kind of the first generation, maybe step change in natural language processing. And this is, BERT came out that year, but even before that, there was a model ULM fit. And prior to that, models were 20 or 30% worse than humans when it came to like classifying documents by topic, say, if you're news, sports, military, whatever. And so you couldn't use them for a lot of use cases. And I was taking a class, and the professor, Jeremy Howard, demonstrated using these new, now they're kind of small language models, but at the time they
Mhm,
were pretty big. He demonstrated just, oh, we just like surpassed the previous state of the art by like 20%. And
mhm,
usually improvements in the ML space are just like, tiny little tweaks. You're just inching up by like 0.1%.
mhm,
And my mind is what like, I was like, could not believe it. My mind was racing. And we were doing a lot of work with text at the time. And we were paying, dozens of people to manually label documents for our customers.
mhm,
And so we quickly, on the machine learning side, teamed up with that group and said, hey, like we think this, I saw this on kind of a demo. We think it'll actually work on kind of our real data. Let's try it out. And we were able to try it out, and we increased their throughput by over 1,000%.
mhm.
At basically like, I would say effectively no cost. It's probably hundreds of dollars, maybe $1,000 a month or something like that. It was that order of magnitude.
Mhm,
And so we still had humans in the loop to kind of check things and make sure if it was low, low confidence, or if there were new labels coming in or new ontologies coming in. So there was still a use for the humans. We didn't decrease the team size, but we just increased the amount of value that we were able to give to our customers by, almost, effectively no money when you look at the scale of the program we were talking about.
absolutely. Yeah, no, that's incredible. And it's amazing that you were able to surpass what was the industry, standard by 20% without even really realizing it. Or until after the case, right?
Yeah. And yeah. And I think, being, as users of, ChatGPT, we're really at the forefront, right? Most people are still not using this for their jobs. And I
Mhm,
think, as someone who's been using it a lot, you kind of think, oh, you get so used to it, you don't realize, you probably think everybody else is using it. And so I went to present on that project at a conference a year later. So to us, we've been doing this every day for a year. We'd implemented in production. And I was like, oh, is it even worth like giving this talk? People are going to find it boring. And it was like a standing room only room. People
mhm.
asked questions so long afterwards. I had to go out in the hall and answer questions afterwards. And so it was a good reminder that I think, a lot of people are just so focused on their day to day in their jobs, and they don't have time to step back and kind of do that survey of what's going on out there, even if you are a data scientist or in machine learning. And
Mhm,
so that's part of what I'm really excited to, bring this to the federal space, is because it really can have an impact in certain use cases. It's not going to solve every single problem. And I think some people are probably out there selling it like it's going to solve every single problem under the sun. And that's
mhm,
not the case. But there's so much low hanging fruit from document summarization or chatting with documents,
mhm.
again, just drafting, kind of relatively simple things. Like I use it for LinkedIn posts and abstracts and those sort of things where the marginal value between my best work ever and like the step below,
Mhm.
right? Think how quickly you go by, the post on LinkedIn, right? You're not really going to notice if that was the best writing Matt's ever done.
Right.
But you're still going to get the message across, and we're going to be able to communicate in an effective way.
100%. Yeah. And I use it constantly in my work. I use it for, for LinkedIn posts, for marketing, for, things like that. Absolutely. If when I'm, in my recruiting world, whenever I'm looking to submit somebody, I'll put their resume into it and have it summarize it in 5 or 6 bullets and highlight specific kinds of experience. That is great because and again, it will it may not do it as well as I can, but it will take it you know, 15 seconds instead of me taking 30 minutes. And when I'm spending so much time, when I have, you know, and you, I mean, you're incredibly busy too. You know how it is.
Yeah.
That time savings is that's just buying your time back, which is invaluable to me personally.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
100%. I mean, and again, there's those tasks that you're just never going to have time to get to, right? We always have, I have my to-do list. I'm sure you have yours, and there are things that, are kind of sitting at the bottom for just weeks on end. And is it better to just do that at 90% or 80%, or is it better
mhm,
to just have it sit there for another month? And
right.
sometimes, again, the lower value tasks that people aren't going to notice that, you might be the only one who notices that it wasn't your best work.
Absolutely. 100%. And I will take that personally, but that's okay, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and but you're absolutely right. And like and I think that it's fascinating when you start thinking about you know, it's ways to make us more productive, and it's ways to, you know, and just allowing is I find that I only have so much attention span in a day, to your point earlier, that they just don't sleep and they don't stop. And I have a finite amount of brain power in a day, and I want to spend that in the best, most effective way I possibly can. And, you know, I think, you know, for me, the best use of a lot of this stuff has been coming like, you know, giving myself the freedom to choose what I focus my brain on, and choose where I spend my focus, and choose where I spend my mental energy in more strategic ways. Between that and having an assistant has changed my world, you know, because now
Yeah.
I can do like, you know, I can do what I'm good at, right? Because I bring things to an organization and bring things to my organizations that other people can't do. And that means that, you know, and you know, a lot of the stuff that I use AI for is the things that I don't need to bring 100% of my brain power to, right? Um, and it's easier to
Yeah.
edit text than it is to create new text, right? And so a lot of the time I'll have it,
Oh, yeah.
you know, write something for me and then understand that I'm going to go in and edit it, rework it, and make it my own a little bit. But what scares me is the folks that don't do it. And I'm sure you heard about the attorneys who used it to write
Uh,
briefs for them,
yeah.
and it created fake supporting cases, and they submitted it to a judge without even reading it, right? And I worry that people, you know, something
Yeah.
I worry that people aren't gonna go back and understand that it's not a final product.
Yeah. And I think too, like, and you can learn there, it's a skill you can get better at, right? It is a tool like anything else. And I remember when I first started using Excel, right? I didn't
Mhm,
know formulas and pivot tables and how to use all that. VLOOKUP, right, was kind of a mystery
mhm,
for such a long time. And once you get used to that, right, you can just fly around the keyboard and you can do things 10 times faster than you could before. And it's similar. We had a prompting lunch and learn actually earlier this week to teach people some of the, like, how you can craft better prompts and get more value out of it. And
mhm,
some of the simple stuff is that I've done is ask for 5 different versions of something, like a LinkedIn post. So that
mhm,
way, I'm not just editing one. I can kind of start with the one that I like best, edit that, and then again, it just saves me like a little bit more time. And that was like a little light bulb that went off, of asking for 3 to 5 examples of something instead of just one post.
mhm.
I feel like I get better quality that way.
Interesting. Yeah, what I used to do, and I still do it sometimes, is I'll have ChatGPT create a post, and then I'll take it and feed it into at the time it was Bard, but now it's Gemini, and then I'll take what Gemini gives me and feed it back into and so
Yep.
run it through multiple LLMs until I get it to the point where it's like, you know, that's pretty good, right? Because then it's not just one engine giving you things. 'Cause I know well, I don't know. I think that different ones are better at different things, and they will approach things differently, and they'll and so that's a something that I've done personally. I don't know, have you done that or no?
Yeah.
Mhm,
I haven't actually. It reminds me a little of, I have seen it kind of giving almost different personalities or like prompts. So you have kind of different agents, right, with like different perspectives. And there are like ones where it's like an editor and a writer, and maybe you have writers with like, you're a technical writer, you're more of a writer with a different background. And you kind of have them iterate kind of amongst themselves.
mhm,
And I think I
mhm,
was thinking actually about the leading up to this talk, thinking about the risks of it, right? We anthropomorphize, these tools a lot too. And that is one of the risks of these, is that I think on the, security side of it, you maybe are more likely to give up information you shouldn't, because like a lot of the risk isn't new, right? I could post classified information into Google, or or it may not classified because I QE or something like that, right? That I have on my computer that's in a safe spot where it's allowed to be. But like when you start, but like Google, you understand that's an external party, it's a third party system. If you're in like a conversation and it's a human like conversation with these tools that often have names associated with them, it's easier to let your guard down, I feel like. And so I do think that's one of the risks that we need to, in the federal space, need to learn to guard against. And in our personal space too, right? Like, what information are you sharing out there?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, when we talk about cyber, the weakest point of any organization is the people. I've had, and their behaviors. And I know, like we having worked in the healthcare space quite extensively, I know that we've been a
Yeah.
target for things like phishing attacks and things like that. And I constantly run campaigns on folks that work for me around, fake phishing, fake this, fake that, and everybody that fails goes through remedial training. What do you think trainings like that for this will look like, and what do you think some good ways to test people are?
Ooh, how do you test people? That's a good question. I mean, I think, it's kind of, I've heard the term like a Swiss cheese defense before. And I think that's, one of the approaches. So you can have kind of the, maybe firewall approach, because like we're all going to slip up, at some point, right? It might, for you who's like super aware, it might only be one in a million times. But, sometimes, you're tired, maybe a kid was sick, you're checking something on your phone real quick.
Mhm,
And, it's, again, we're able to do a little more research on you. And so it's getting more and more real. So training just isn't enough. So yeah, having that kind of air defense to kind of as a backup. I think the training, I mean, I haven't thought as much about this aside from like, a normal training where you give people examples of,
mhm,
what is out there. Because again, a lot of people don't realize, with a picture and 60 seconds of audio, I can basically recreate
mhm,
anybody in the world
mhm,
in a very realistic way where nobody will be able to tell the difference.
mhm,
But also, I think maybe you could have simulations as well, too, or right, or examples, so people are seeing this and interacting with these sorts of things, and maybe even again trying to trick them in some way,
mhm, mhm.
kind of like an advanced, phishing attack. It's not something I've thought about too much, but it is something that we're going to have to figure out.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I agree we're gonna have to figure it out. I haven't spent a huge amount of time thinking about it yet either, but I know it's something that as leaders of organizations that are vulnerable to these things, we're gonna need to continue to think about it and continue to iterate on it to come up with ways to defend our organization and defend our people.
Yeah,
And defend ourselves and our reputations as companies and people as well. And something that I found interesting is I'm not sure if you saw this. This is a couple of months ago. George Carlin's family sued somebody who had they had an AI bot write a stand-up special in his style and then essentially used AI to create a avatar of him giving doing like a stand up in front of folks. And like I think things like that will become far
yeah,
more common, and in on one of the in one state that just voted in the primaries, I saw in the news that somebody had a robocall of Biden's voice urging people not to vote, right? And things like that are just terrifying. It's terrifying the
yeah.
downside application, the negative applications and the bad actors and what they can do with, frankly, very little effort and very little money now.
Yeah, yeah, I am concerned about that. Bring up, Biden, the election, right? With,
Mhm,
kind of, I think we're all doing a lot of learning when it comes to these technologies. There's a lot of similarities to previous cyber concerns, but there are new ones as well. And part of that is the lower barrier of entry that you mentioned, right? Is that it's not some super sophisticated actor. For,
mhm,
someone's like 15 cents, I can make a realistic video. And that is something that terrifies me, that we are kind of releasing these new technologies right in the lead up to the election.
mhm,
I mean, it'd be shocking if we didn't see something pretty sophisticated. And I think again, like hopefully the social media companies are going to be aware of that, and really putting the resources into stopping any sort of viral spread. As we lead up, especially the days or hours to the election.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, that is something that I'm really worried about.
As am I, right? Because, I just I'd like to just have elections where we're not trying to be influenced, right? And let people make their own decisions. And unfortunately, I think that there's just going to be a lot of dirty games that are played because of the amount of power at stake, especially in this country and our elections here. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I do worry about things like that though, but I am hopeful that, and what also worries me is that when you look at the population that votes and how many of them are, just frankly, like voting, as you get older, you people are going to vote in higher numbers, right? And many of them, I feel like, are not equipped to even begin to understand this technology and what it can do.
Uh,
Uh,
yeah, I'm no longer on Facebook, but I've
mhm,
seen, I think it was an article written about there are these accounts that post, synthetically generated images of like special moments in people's lives or whatever. And if you're familiar with kind of the image generation technology, you can pretty quickly tell that these are fake images,
mhm.
but they'll get tens of thousands of likes and comments and people congratulating, this non-existent grandma on her 115th birthday, or, somebody, some other accomplishment. And, when they're that obvious, and this is like, again, not the most sophisticated of operations that where this is happening, if you start thinking about, third parties, adversaries that, have a lot at stake in this election, you could imagine being much more sophisticated, video, audio, kind of a whole package, and then a network ready to propagate that information across, Twitter or Facebook or other platforms as well.
Absolutely. So, I know we're getting close to time and as we're starting to wrap up, on a happier note, man, what do you think is the most exciting or most promising aspect of this prevalence and rise to prevalence? And what are you most excited about over the next couple of years?
Oh man, it's funny when you say next couple of years. That's hard because when I try to give talks looking out that far ahead, a lot of times things I sketch out will then be released like the next month. So,
All right, let's go next six
yeah,
months then.
yeah, yeah. I do think GPT-5 being released. I'll use that kind of as broadly as I think OpenAI has tended to kind of lead the pack. So it'll be kind of the GPT-5 class models. Um, is really exciting for say like software development, long form writing, and then just like kind of having conversations. Like I've started to try to have conversations, because you can use like the audio version of OpenAI to kind of think out loud. And I found that medium works well when thinking through some sorts of things. I do think there's going to be a lot of societal implications, though, kind of on the flip side of it. Sorry to bring it back to negative or
Okay.
downside, but we didn't talk about, I think, a lot of societal implications of this. If you can start doing this, like call centers, I've heard kind of, are you going to scale down significantly the number of people that are needed in call centers?
Mhm,
For pretty, a lot of the calls are for pretty basic things. How do I reset my password? How do I change my reservation? And you don't really need to wait, on a telephone call for 30 minutes to talk to a real person to get that stuff done. And that's with this current version of models. If you start thinking about that next generation of models, yeah, and when you think about junior employees too, right? It can, like, let's say, GPT-5 can code at a junior to mid-level software developer.
mhm.
How does that change, people coming out of college and the implications for how we build our workforce? And yeah, like, subject matter experts can make use of these tools, at kind of a pretty sophisticated level. But how do you build up that next layer of subject matter experts if there's the temptation maybe by some large companies to save money by kind of having a smaller junior class?
Mhm.
There's a lot of things I think that we're going to need to think about, as a society, if this trajectory kind of continues down the path that at least I think it's going to go down, and a lot of people think it's going to go down.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's going to continue to accelerate over the next decade. I think we're about to hit serious exponential growth. It's going to be world changing. It's very, very, very exciting, which is equal parts exciting and terrifying and all of it.
Yeah.
But, you
I will
know,
say maybe to bring it back to the happy side, I think is that, I think the optimistic view of this is that it will allow people to automate kind of the drudgery within their jobs and very rote stuff, the thing that you do 100 times a week or 50 times a week that you just really don't like doing. It's not a core part of your job. If you
mhm,
can cut down, 50%, 75% of the amount of time you spend on that, and then step back and think about big picture strategy and actually like the big picture improvements to your role, to your company, to your coworkers. I think
Hmm.
that's really exciting. If we can all kind of decrease the drudgery that's entered and crept into our lives,
Hmm.
I think that could make work more fulfilling and more exciting for a lot of people.
I completely agree. And yeah, we'll end on that note. Matt, I really appreciate you hopping on and taking the time to chat, and really excited to see where we're going over the next decade.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nick. This was a good conversation.
Thank you.